Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Rising Tide Foundation. Matt and Cynthia are on a wonderful journey to Thailand and further Asian locations that we're not sure about. However, I got told by Larry, via Larry, that the food in Thailand apparently is wonderful. And I'm sure that Matt and Cynthia are enjoying themselves tremendously. They have been invited to participate in the conference there. So, and I'm myself and Jerry, we are jumping in as substitute host substitutes, and I'm sure we are not doing as nearly as good a job as Matt is doing, but we'll try our best. So today we have the great honor, of welcoming Larry Freeman to the Rising Tide Foundation. Larry has been involved in African affairs for 35 years, and you can read all of his articles and interviews at Africa and the World. And his website is called Lawrence Freeman, africaandtheworld.com. He also put the link in the chat box. He put an article link in the chat box. So you can access that, and then you can see where the website is. So Larry is going to give us a wonderful presentation, I'm sure, about the geopolitical and historical causes of the breakdown of the rules-based international order in Africa, and the rise of a new potential for a Pan-African Renaissance, which we very, very, very much need and very much look forward to. So with that, I'm opening up, I'm asking Larry to start the presentation. He told me he's not going to do the traditional presentation with a PowerPoint, but basically will just talk. If you have questions, please hold your questions till the end, unless Larry asks you to answer a question. Hold your questions till the end. Put your name in the chat box. Put the question in the chat box if you like, or you can just say, I have a question. And I will moderate the answering questions at the end of Larry's presentation. So thank you very much. And with that, it's all yours, Larry.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. I put a article in the chat box, which gives you some background. I did a class about 3 years ago for Rising Tide Foundation, which had more background. I'm not going to go into that level of detail in this presentation, although I will cover some of the overview and then be leading up to the crucial point that I'll be building towards the middle to end of this presentation. Now, I mean, when we're talking about the African continent, there are some general facts, knowledge that we should all be familiar with. Because of all the continents, it is completely unique from everywhere else in the world. And one of the unique features is there's 54 nations on the continent. There's an argument about whether there's a 55th nation called the Western Sahara, whether that's a nation or not. So it's 54 or 55 nations. And they're all been developed differently. Every one but two were developed by European colonialism. But there's no similarities. Each country has a very unique set of influences that led to its development. And there's also a huge variation in the geography of these countries, the weather pattern of these countries, the location of the deserts, the location of mountain ranges, the location of water, very variegated throughout the entire continent. And of course, the continent is almost 12 million square miles, which is not quite 4 times the size of the continental United States, which is, not counting Hawaii and Alaska, is about 3 million square miles. So it's almost 4 times as large. You've probably seen pictures, I've used them, that most of the rest of the world can fit inside Africa. Europe, China, India, the United States. Most maps, I've not seen any map that actually reflects the size of Africa, because it would be much bigger, either on a globe or a wall map. But it's important to know how large it is. It's very underpopulated. It's only, my estimate is about 1.5 billion people, which is not a lot for that area of land. Of course, the Malthusians are angry there's that many people, even though it's a relatively underpopulated area. There is a sort of division in the continent. We sometimes refer to the subcontinent of sub-Saharan Africa, because at the very northern section of the continent, you have the Sahara Desert. On the top of the Sahara Desert, you have about 5 countries along the Mediterranean. And below that right below the Mediterranean is the Sahara Desert, which is about the size of continental United States. It's about 3 million square miles. And there's a whole history to the Sahara Desert, which is fascinating history, which has nothing to do with climate change and being caused by humans. The change has been going on for millions, if not billions of years. But all that is background, useful information. It's also unique in the fact it's the only continent that suffered massive forced deportation. From my estimates of the amount of people taken out of Africa forcefully, this is not willful migration, is a minimum of 15 million people. Some estimates go up into near 100 million. I think that's too high. Maybe 50 million is on the low end. And of course, most of these people, not most, a minority of these people never even reached the destination. Of course, in the Atlantic, which was estimates are 1 to 3 million Africans may have died on ships transporting them to North America. Now, the majority of slaves went to South America, as we call it. A very small amount, maybe 300 to 500,000, went to North America, but then slaves went to Europe, small number went to the Arab world. So this is the only continent that this ever happened to, where people were just grabbed up like animals and shipped out. And that's another unique feature that has affected Africa. All these factors, climate, conditions, the history of the formation of these countries, the slavery itself over, let's say, 1400 to 1800, all of these factors are relevant to understanding Africa. And this, even though the African nation, there's a strong hypothesis that humankind developed in the African continent. Many scholars think it developed in the Rift Valley. But even though it could be called the cradle of civilization or cradle of mankind's emergence as Homo sapiens sapiens, nevertheless, most African nations didn't start to achieve independence until the 60s. Ghana and Sudan had independence in 57 and 56, respectively. And then about 30 nations achieved independence during the 60s. And then over the course of the next 30 years, various nations achieved independence. And we say that the last country that achieved independence was South Africa, because they finally had the right of the majority Black population to vote, was in 1994. In fact, April 27th, maybe, somewhere around there, was the 30th anniversary, I believe, of the election of Nelson Mandela, which was the first election that allowed all people, majority Black people, to vote. So that's 1994. That's only 30 years ago. The two countries that were never colonized, one is Liberia, which has a very unique existence being partly formed by free slaves from the United States. It's very unique. It's not, doesn't fit in the pattern of the rest of the continent. And then the other country that never was colonized is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia doesn't have Independence Day like we have July 4th. Every African nation has an Independence Day. Ethiopia doesn't have Independence Day because it was never colonized. It does have Adwa Day, ADWA, March 1st, 1896, when Menelik II defeated the Italian army on the battlefield in northern Ethiopia. And this had never happened before. And this also was a groundbreaking development, which led to a great deal of hysteria in Europe, including the resignation of the Prime Minister of Italy. And that was very close to the Boers War, which I know Madeline one time gave a presentation on. But if the British had lost the Boers War, which they almost did, they suffered massive casualties. If they had lost the Boer War following the defeat of Italy on the battlefield in northern Ethiopia, empires might have been different. The whole world might have been different, because empires, with two major empires collapsing, this could have had a shockwave effect throughout the whole world. So that gives you some of the background. Now, Ethiopia is a country I work very closely with over the last 5 to 10 years, and they reflect the fact that they weren't colonized. And all these countries reflect what happened to them, how they were liberated, who liberated them, like Kwame Nkrumah, who is sometimes considered the father of liberation of African nations, the first president of independent Ghana. He has a very unique history, with the United States, very different. He went to school in Lincoln University in Pennsylvania in the 30s and then went to college in the United States. And he actually experienced personally the Reconstruction program of Franklin Roosevelt. And that had a lasting effect on him as he developed a Reconstruction program for the United States of Africa, which he wrote about, and many other anti-colonial policies. So that's just one example. And all of these inputs, which we might call the long wave of ideas, have effects on the mindsets of these African nations. Now, currently, that's a little bit of a picture of the past. Currently, Africa is going through all kinds of changes. You probably have noticed here, reading the news, that a number of countries in what we call the Sahel is a thin desert at the bottom of the Sahara Desert. That's the transition into the rest of more lush green savannas of Africa. And the Sahel stretches across the whole continent, from one side all the way across to Sudan. And there's a bunch of countries along the Sahel. And you may have noticed in the news over the last several years, several of these countries have carried out coups. In the coup that they're carrying out, they're actually throwing out their colonial master, so to speak. The French and the British were the two main empires in Africa. There was the Portuguese, the Italian, German prior to World War I, but the French and the British really divided up the continent significantly. And so you've had coups in Mali. Well, the French, after they left, set up Francophone countries, which they control financially. So that's the connection. Even though these countries are supposed to be free, the French have insidiously involved themselves in the very culture and financial control of these countries. I've been to a number of them. So there's about 14 of them. So you've had, though, in the last 3 to 4 years, you had a coup in Mali, which was supposed to be a great country held up by France, the United States as a model, and that coup there toppled the country back many years ago. And then there was a second coup. There was a coup in Burkina Faso. There was more recently, you probably read about the coup in Niger. There was also not technically a coup, but there was a unconstitutional change in power in Chad, where the leader, Deby, was killed. It's unclear. There's many different stories about how he was killed, but his son, a general, took over, which was not in the Constitution. And I think the Gabon is now also considering changing its current affiliation with the French. So there's a bunch of coups going on in the Sahel, which is sometimes what intersects what we call West Africa. But I would say, even despite these coups, and we don't really know, they are anti-colonial, but will they lead to economic progress? And what were the causes of the coups? And this is a problem that the rules-based international order has, is they don't really want to face the reality of what caused the coups. They just want to use their mentality to continue to undermine these countries and undermine Russia and China throughout the continent, which we'll get more into as we go along. You may not know that South Africa, which is arguably the most industrialized nation in Africa, it's the only country that actually has a nuclear power plant, which was built prior to the Mandela election. Now South Africa is under attack by the US government. There's actually a bill in the US Congress to punish South Africa because it's, quote, endangering the national security of the United States. It's hard to imagine how any African country could endanger US security, but the reason is, and they're explicit in this bill, which comes out of the House Foreign Affairs Committee by some very foolish people, the fact that South Africa talks to China. Ooh. South Africa talks to Russia. Ooh. South Africa talks to Iran. Ooh. And South Africa has even talked to Hamas. Well, leaving Hamas out for the moment, Russia, China, Iran, that's the axis of evil. And they're trying to lump South Africa now into being the axis of evil. So you have to think about, why would you attack South Africa with this, again, this rich history, which was gone over, I guess, a couple of months ago by Marilyn. They pride themselves on the fact that they morally stand up for the underdog throughout the world because of the lessons they learned from fighting apartheid. And they consider it, I mean, I've talked to them all the time, they consider it a badge of honor that they brought the issue of Israel's genocide to the International Court of Justice. And they would do it again, no matter the fact that they've experienced persecution for that. If you go into the western part of Africa today, we're now in the present, you look at Nigeria, which has estimated about 220 million people, maybe more, projected to double that in population. But they have 90 or so million people living on $2.15 or less a day. They have a horrible situation in national security, protecting themselves from Boko Haram. And they are now going through a massive devaluation of their currency, the naira. Now, I mean, they're talking about devaluating it down to 1,000 naira to the dollar. Uh, I, for historical purposes, I call your attention to 1983, when the country was ruled by then what they call dictator. Actually, a person I got to know very well, Muhammadu Buhari, who became elected president recently, but then he was a military dictator. And at that time, before he was couped, and this is why he was couped by the British, the naira was worth $1.34. So 1 naira, you could get more than $1.25. Now it's 1,000 naira to the dollar. It's a very difficult situation. There's a part of Nigeria that's economically growing, but there's great misery throughout the large sections of the population. And it's unclear exactly what the future is going to be for Nigeria. Now, Nigeria has a very large military force, and it may be the second or first biggest economy, depending how you count it, relative to South Africa. But it's never primarily due to oil and real estate. With China, they've launched a massive train development, which is great, because I started going to Nigeria in 1994, and all we did was drive on these blacktop roads, which had enough room for a car and a half. So when a car came at you, you had to pull halfway off the road into the dirt and let that car pass, and then you got back on the blacktop. But back, I think it was several years ago, I got a chance to take a train from Abuja, the capital of Kaduna, which is most populated city, one of the most populated cities in the north. And it was wonderful to take a train. And there are trains now being built all over Nigeria. Now, this is not everything is going smoothly, but this is something that has to be done. And without rail transportation, there is no development. So that's it's a situation it's a challenge. There is some progress, but on the other hand, there's some serious economic problems that the country is facing, which could get worse as a result of this devaluation. If you look at the eastern part of the continent, and I'm mainly discussing today sub-Saharan Africa, there are very interesting things going on above the desert as well. But Ethiopia, which has 120 million people, so that's the second largest country in Africa. Nigeria around 220 or so, Ethiopia around 120. And they're going through all kinds of problems, but there is significant economic expansion. They did build the first electric railroad in 2016 from Addis Ababa, with many stops along the way, to the port of Djibouti. I took that train on the day it was inaugurated. But they went through a horrible war from 2020 to 2022, which they still not recovered from. And there's more destabilizations going on in Ethiopia. They use ethnic nationalism to divide the country. And there is a lot of conflict and fighting going on after this war, which was a very destructive war, which I was supporting the nation of Ethiopia throughout this entire war against the United States, which took the position of supporting the Tigray People's Liberation Front's effort to overthrow the country. So we'll get into why the United States keeps doing this. But Ethiopia is key to the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is a very eastern section that people think looks like a horn. And that's Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia, Somaliland, and Ethiopia. And now there's another conflict over Ethiopia's desire to get a modernized port, to increase their capability for trade on the Red Sea or Gulf of Eden, Indian Ocean, that trade route. And that's now being blown up into potential conflict. If you go to my website, you'll see, I think, 2 articles ago, I wrote extensively on the efforts to instigate a war in the Horn of Africa. So these just give you, so these are Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, very large country. South Africa, not so in population. And they are very much major factors in the progress of the whole, or lack of progress in the continent. Kenya, which is in East Africa, just below Ethiopia, also plays a very significant role with its previous president, Kenyatta, who was the son of the founder of the country, Jomo Kenyatta, and now the current president, Uhuru Ruto, have made certain advances, also on the question of infrastructure development. And I might say also in Ethiopia, they're making some real success in agricultural development. All these countries, every country on the continent, it suffers from massive underdevelopment of any kind of infrastructure, of manufacturing, of modern agriculture. And again, I'll give you some example. I'll give you some quotes in a little while, but we're now in the 2024. I mean, we're in the 21st century here. And Africa doesn't look like a 21st century nation. The nations of Africa don't look like they belong to the 21st century. So why would that be occurring and continues to occur? So there are many other parts of the continent. I'm just highlighting a few areas. You're probably also familiar with the current situation in Sudan, where there's been not a civil war, but a war, nevertheless, between two armies. One is a national army of the country, and the other is a militia. And it's very complicated because there's many different sides. But overall, my analysis is this could have been prevented if we had, over the previous 30 years, built a strong nation in Sudan. And you can't just look at the present as if it just popped up. These things have history to them. Sudan was punished for decades for a bloodless coup that the United States then made Sudan a pariah and denied the basic economic development assistance, which could have made the country a strong nation. They had the largest agricultural potential at one point of any nation in Africa. At one point, their potential was analyzed that it could feed 1 billion people in the 70s, which would have been then the size of the population of the whole continent. And I've been in and out of Sudan since the 90s as well. And the policy for development wasn't there. And all these cases, what is glaring is the lack of support for the policy of development. And we could go into more countries. I haven't by any means, as I said, there's 54 countries, but I'm trying to give you some highlights that give you an understanding a little bit of a gestalt of what is going on in the continent. There are some very important political leaders in the continent who recognize these deficiencies and are now challenging them, including the outstanding equivalent of foreign minister of South Africa, Natalie Pandor, who is probably the most best example of a great stateswoman on the continent, in my view. And there are other leaders, and we'll discuss that a little bit, who are trying to push forward for a development policy. There's also the energy minister of South Africa. There's others that we will discuss. But it's a fight because they're fighting against an entrenched policy of no development. That's the problem. So it's more than an uphill fight. So there is, I don't know if I call it Pan-Africanism, but there is a spirit going across that touches many different parts of the continent and different leaders who realize that this is the time they have to make a fight to actually provide energy, provide manufacturing, provide jobs for their country, because the biggest factor you have is poverty. With you have massive poverty, abject poverty. The statistics that we've seen, these are just statistics, but they give us some inference of what's going on, is you have in the order of 500 million, maybe 450 million Africans in poverty. That's not only the largest number of poverty, of people living in poverty of any continent, but it's also the only area in the world. The other area, Southeast Asia, is massive poverty. But the poverty, numbers of people living in poverty in Africa is growing. The rest of the world, it's declining. And the percentage may be declining because the population is so large, but the absolute numbers of more of people living in poverty are growing in Africa, contrary to every other area of the world. You have 600 million people, which is almost half the population. If we take 500 million people and living in poverty, that's about a third of the population. 600 million people, so that's about 40% of the population, has no access to electricity. And those people who do have access to electricity don't have it 24/7. In Nigeria, the most populated country, the level of kilowatts per capita, per household, is appalling. And people use generators, which they put gasoline into, so much for the concern for the environment. They fill these things with gasoline. They pay more for their gas and electric bills than we pay in the West, or at least the United States and Canada. This is because no energy production has been built on the level necessary to be supplied to the population, which also undermines their ability to be a productive manufacturing economy. In fact, the total manufacturing trade, products of trade manufactured in Africa are 2 to 3% of global trade of manufactured products. So it's a deliberately underdeveloped continent. Now, let's take just a peek at the future. What are we looking at? Well, all the projections are that by 2040, 2050, so that is 26 years from now, which I'm working hard to make sure I'm around for, there is expected that the African continent, of all these 54, 55 nations, could be 2.5 billion people. Some say 2.4, some say 2.5. Who's counting? Now, that is already a very significant strategic question, because the same projections are that the world population by 2050 will be 9.4, 9.5, 9.6 billion people, which means that the African continent will have 1/4 of all people on this planet will have been born in Africa. It also means that the African continent will be the biggest market, single market in the world. Nigeria is expected to have 450 million people. Even though it has 100 million people less than the United States, us Americans are not inclined to reproduce sufficiently, while the Africans are. So their population is going to overtake the United States. And it will be the third largest population in the world. Number one will be India. Number two will be China. Number three will be Nigeria. These are projections. Ethiopia's population will be well over 150 million people. Egypt is already over 100 million. We haven't discussed Egypt too much. So there's going to be some huge amount of people on this continent, which means what? Which means this is going to be the center of economic commerce and trade in the world, because you're going to be looking for the biggest market. And it means that strategically, economically, and politically, if anyone in the West still has any quality thinking power left, they would be thinking about how to develop this continent. because either it's going to be a great potential for economic growth of the planet, or it's going to be the breeding ground for more asymmetric warfare, what we call terrorists, which I think is a loose term. But essentially, if you have people who are living in poverty and you have young people who can't find jobs and are alienated from the country and alienated from society, those are the people that are desperate, and desperate people can be manipulated to do desperate and foolish things. And this is the problem. Now, they estimate that the workforce of Africa will be over 1 billion people. The young youth from the age of 35 to 40 down will be over 1 billion people. And in fact, one article I read said that because of the failure, we can dig this one in a little bit, of the Caucasian people of Europe and the United States, because of their failure to reproduce, there will be a need to import people from Africa into the labor markets of Europe and the United States because there'll be such a shortage of labor. That's going to be a reversal of the immigration problem. So if you are thinking strategically, as probably everybody is who's involved in this discussion, you would say to yourself, wow, we've got to really get moving here to develop this continent, because this is going to be it's the centerpiece of strategic economic policy on our planet over the next slightly more than one generation from where we are today. So that gives you what we should be thinking about, and we're dealing with a continent, as I mentioned earlier, very poor in many respects, very undeveloped, not less intelligent than we are. In fact, the United States benefits from all the intelligent professionals who come from Africa and become members, leading members of our society. Many doctors in the United States are Nigerian nurses, registered nurses, technicians. And as you probably know, there's a famous movie out where some leading actor plays the role of a Nigerian doctor who discovered the disease that football players get from concussions. So we should be thinking about, how do we develop this continent? But now we have the question, development? Development? What does that mean? And you'll find, if you look at policy from the West, and I know best, of course, the United States, I interact with various think tanks and various people here in Washington, the word development is almost been eliminated from our lexicon. Nobody even thinks about development. No one talks about development. There is no policy for development. And this is part of the problem. Now, to bring it into the current state, I'll just read you a little bit, because there was a recent meeting, April 29th in Kenya, Nairobi, the capital. It was called the International Development Association, IDA Summit, which is a branch of the World Bank. And just to give you an idea of what was discussed, the president of Uganda, who's been around a long time, President Museveni, he said to the World Bank, part of the quotes I have from him, he said, if you are serious, I need to hear about how low-cost funding for manufacturing, not stories for manufacturing, but actually funding. The main reason there is no growth in Africa is that the growth factors are neither funded nor understood. Those who want to help Africa should fund our transport systems, electricity, raw material processing, and import substitution. Our populations are increasing, but our economies are stunted. Now, this is just last week, 2024. And Museveni is still talking about the need for growth, economic growth. There was the president of Tanzania also spoke there, Suluhu Hassan. And she said, considering the challenges related to the present projected debt levels, we strongly believe that the IDA, the World Bank, should focus more on providing concessional loans, such as 50-year credit loans. These facilities would provide more fiscal space for African countries to address competing development needs. So this is just last week, where you have two leaders, and Tanzania, I think P.D. Lawton went through some of the progress they're making, and they're asking, here we are in the 21st century, they're asking for loans for manufacturing, for electricity, long-term loans. Now, this is not, as we say, rocket science. We're not discovering cancer. We, humanity, humankind, knows how to produce economic growth. This is not something that grew up in Museveni's head in the last week or so. The United States and the West provides no long-term concessional loans or long-term loans at low interest rates. And they also sometimes have a grace period even after the 20-year loan. China was giving a great deal of concessional loans for a number of years. So here are these loans, and the West doesn't make any of them. Now, that's very strange. We don't support growth. We don't believe in development. Development doesn't enter into any of our discussions except to motivate, quote, the private sector to take up the question of development. But the United States was built on government-directed credit, from Hamilton to Roosevelt to Kennedy. We either created credit mechanisms, such as Hamilton's National Bank, such as Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and in Kennedy's case, he took money directly out of the budget, just out of the capital budget, for loans, for credit, long-term credit. And this is no longer understood. It's become, we have amnesia when it comes to the question of development. So the United States doesn't support it. There's an idea of the Grand Inca, which was a series, I think, of to be 8 or 9 dams built on the Inca Falls, which is the end of the Congo River before it dumps its water into the Atlantic Ocean. And this was written by a great Senegalese scholar 60 plus years ago, that we could get 50 to 100,000 megawatts of power from the Grand Inca. And the really only ones who support the Grand Inca, or have in the past in a major way, is South Africa. The West says nothing about it. The Ethiopians are nearly completed what's called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, G-E-R-D. It's almost completed. When it is completed, it will have produced 5,150 megawatts of power, all funded by Ethiopians, because they weren't getting any help from any of the financial institutions. So they funded it themselves from their people. Beautiful structure. I visited a couple of years ago, one of the happiest days of my life, walking along this great structure. And it will be the biggest injection of new energy on the African continent in decades, maybe longer. It doesn't solve, it's not nearly enough. From my standpoint, it's much too little. But it is nevertheless the major injection. The United States and the West will say nothing about this. In fact, they punished Ethiopia during the Ethiopian TPLF war and kicked them out of AGOA and punished them economically, but never supported 5,150 megawatts of power. Why? Why don't you support energy when I already said 600 million Africans don't have access? It's the most important single infrastructure. Along with rail, it can change countries. The lack of electricity kills more people every day than anything else in Africa because you need electricity for everything: power, cooling, schools, hospitals, vaccines, everything, manufacturing. So here you have all this power being put into the continent. It's going to be in East Africa, obviously, and nothing for the United States. No support for this. There's a program that some of us worked on called the Transaqua to bring water from the wet region of the Congo Basin to the dry region of the Chad Basin. And nothing from the West to support it, except for Italy. Italy was the only country that actually supported this. There's no one in the United States who even wanted to be involved in this, except there was some section of the US military that understood the importance of this. And there was, I can tell you now, there was a closed door meeting many years ago. And even though most people know I don't support most of the US policies, I was invited to the meeting because of my expertise on Transaqua. But the government, outside of a small section of the military, completely uninterested. So you think about why. So look at this question on China. I mean, this is one of the most obviously, blatantly outrageous policies the United States has had, is attacking Africa and China. I mean, they had involvements in Africa going back to the liberation days. They did involve themselves in some economic development, I think in transportation in Tanzania in the 70s. But they went in a big way starting in 2000. I mean, big investments in infrastructure. I think over 20 years, we're talking about $160 billion of government-supported long-term credit infrastructure investments. Now, I understand the United States doesn't agree with China. I can understand that. But why would you attack a nation, China, that is not only bringing its own people out of poverty, but has involved itself in building the most infrastructure of the rest of the advanced sector combined and I think China's investments is 3 times, if you added up all the other total investments by the West combined, China is probably 3 times more than that. So why do you attack it? You know, when it's bringing electricity, it's bringing ports, it's building schools, it's building plants, it's building hospitals. Why would you attack it? Okay, you don't like China, but here's something that's coming in to help people who live in completely underdeveloped nations. And so therefore, the concept of physical economic growth, I mean physical, not fiscal. Someone once corrected me and said, "You mean fiscal?" I said, "No, physical. What is real, tangible wealth? Electricity, consumption and production per square capita, per square kilometer. Electricity, agriculture, production, consumption. Rail is measured by distance of the rail divided by the square area of the country. These are physical products. The consumption of material existence to improve the standard of living of African people. How much food do they need? How much housing do they need? How much electricity do they need? People in these human rights groups, I work with a couple that, because I've won them over to my view, but the human rights groups and the NGOs and these democracy groups, they're fakers. I mean, there may be well-intentioned young people joining them out of some moral concern. I don't mind that. But the people at the top who run these things, this is a fake operation. Because how can you talk about human rights if you don't have electricity? how can you talk about democracy if people don't have the time to think? You want a real democracy? Let's go. Then we should have educated citizens discussing policy for the future of their country. Who's going to discuss policy when half the continent is simply trying to light a light bulb or scratch together food for the next day for their kids? So that's why I say these people are phonies, because it would make the number one demand of any human rights group would be electricity. The number one demand of any democracy group would be electricity. You want thinking people? Build housing. Build housing with multiple bedrooms for the children, and they can have electricity, and they can read it books. I know we don't read books anymore like I do, but even electricity for their tablets. But they're not concerned about this. The idea, the concept, the word almost of development, of physical economic growth is now lost, either on tension or out of ignorance, but it no longer exists in the West. That's the problem. So there's no policy that comes from the West that knows or concerned about physical economic growth. Monetary growth, yes. Stock markets, I used to love the fact that Ethiopia rejected ever having a stock market. One of the things I liked about Meles Zenawi, the former leader and founder of modern Ethiopia. But now they've been won over to the idea, I think, they're starting a stock market, they have a stock market. There are some very super rich islands and zones in Nigeria where very wealthy people live, and real estate is off the charts. But that's not producing physical economic growth for the people. So this is the problem. We don't have a conception of development and growth, physical economic growth. Now we're leading up to the point in this discussion where we have to get to the heart, the nub of why that exists. And that's because of the mentality of the axioms, rather, not the mentality, but the axioms of the rules-based international order, which is the modern name that Tony Blinken's, the U.S. Secretary of State for the Department of State, U.S. Secretary for the Department of the State Department, Tony Blinken and all these guys, they talk about this rules-based order. We have a rules-based order. China doesn't follow the rules-based order. Russia doesn't follow the rules-based order. We're not going to support any African country that doesn't support the rules-based order, our democracy, our rules. The problem, and this is just a modern name for what we used to call the Anglo-American mentality, or the Anglo-American establishment, or the oligarchy. It's the same thing. It's just a different name. But what is the axioms of this rules-based order? And this is the key that most people don't understand. And I have some limited discussions with governments and people who are relatively versed in politics, in Africa in particular, in the United States. This concept of what is the rules-based order mindset is the most difficult thing for people to understand, because the axioms of the rule-based order are based on a hatred of mankind, humankind. The mentality of what we call geopolitics is the so-called zero-sum game, that the world is a fixed pie. It's only so many slices, and you have you could divide the pie 50% by cutting it down the middle of its diameter, and it doesn't grow, it doesn't develop, it doesn't change. It's only, do you have 51% of the pie, or do you have 49% of the pie? Who is the plus means there's going to be a minus. And therefore, the plus and the minus equals zero, because no change takes place. No growth takes place. No transformation takes place. Why do I say this is a anti-human mindset? These axioms are anti-human. And now we get to the core issue, human beings. And this is where we look at the great thinkers, great playwrights, great musicians, great philosophers. In my mind, Socrates and Plato. I live for those, to read their thinking and their dialogues. The idea that human beings have what's called a mind, or I might call a mind soul, because I believe the soul and the mind are very much attached. And no other creature has it. I love my 3 rescue cats. They may have some kind of inner soul, but it's not a human quality. They learn from us to be human. And they've learned it so well they manipulate us. That anyone who has cats knows. But the fact of the matter is, they're not human. The apes that we allegedly, some idiots think we came from, are not human. There's only one human race. In fact, we don't know of any other species in the universe that resembles human beings, because human beings have this very unique, special power called creativity. Some people call it creative mentation, the creative imagination. According to Plato, the power of hypothesis. It's this innate quality, spirit, that only human beings were given by the universe that enables us to discover things that we did not know. They can't be discovered by induction. They can't be discovered by deduction. They can't be added or subtracted. They can't be reproduced by AI, artificial intelligence. They are totally, uniquely a human power of the mind. And this is what we are. And that's why I get so annoyed at some of my friends on these questions of ethnic nationalism, or prejudices of one religion and one people against another, because they're desecrating the human race by their attacks on our fellow human beings. This power of creativity does what? This is the power of economic growth. All physical economic growth comes from the power of the creative mind. It has no bounds. Even when we discover things in the universe that have been in the universe, but we discover them for mankind, humankind, and apply them to humankind. I mean, we've had magnetic poles in our planet forever. And sometimes they actually change. But we had to discover them to produce electricity. The same thing with every single resource comes from a human mind, a discovery. Oil, a discovery. Electricity, a discovery. Space technology starts with Kepler. These are all discoveries of the mind. All wealth comes from the mind. And therefore, this concept of development or physical economic growth, denying this exists, is a crime against the human race itself. And that's why I'm saying the mindset is anti-human. In its core, not everybody's anti-human, but in its core, it's anti-human. This is the case with everybody. We look at Malthus was an example of this. Anybody who puts any limitation on the human mind is anti-human. So what is the problem that the rules-based order has is because they have a prejudice, a deep-seated prejudice against human beings as human beings. They like human beings that they can manipulate. But as human beings with thinking, they have a prejudice, a deep bias, a hatred. So therefore, the zero-sum game, what is that about? They say, well, nations exist. Now, nations are very real. Human beings create a set of laws which are a derivation from the universal laws to govern their society. Has different languages, different cultures. Some are better, some are worse, but the nations exist because they're created by human beings. Now, if you believe that human beings are essentially non-linear creative thinkers, then no nation is ever going to be the same. A nation is always growing, is always developing, is always going to the next level of economic transformation, the next cultural level, not so much in the last 60 years in the West, but we used to go to higher cultural levels. So there is no concept that even approaches a fixed game, a circle, a pie. You have to, instead of seeing a pie, you have to see a spiral of growth, but at least a self-expanding pie, so that it's getting bigger and wider at the same time. So if human beings are capable of continual economic growth, the nations are capable of continued economic growth and change and transformation. So instead of looking at the world as a fixed sum of nations and people to be manipulated, we should be looking at developing a system of how we can collaborate for the future development of the human race. Because look, all human beings are essentially the same. And this really upsets people who are involved in ethnic nationalism. But even this stupid guy who's killing a lot of people in Israel, Netanyahu, he doesn't realize he's the same as the people he's killing, the Palestinians, because they're both human beings. One has decided to be anti-human at the moment, but they were born with the same potential, and their interests are the same. And these ethnic nationalist groups who fight and kill each other, they're stupid as well, because their interests are the same. How do we live a productive life? And almost all human beings want a better life for their children. So it's always about the future. How do we make a better life for our children and grandchildren? And a lot of people I associate with nowadays are giving help to their grandchildren and helping their children. In some cases, the grandparents are better than the children because they're older and wiser and come from a different generation. But all human beings want to commit themselves to a better future, be a productive life, a dignified life, a life of contribution. Even just a housewife who raises children is making a contribution if she raises the children in the proper way. But you're thinking about children, you're thinking about the future, you're thinking about 20 years, 40 years ahead. Where are we going to be? So that's why it started. 2050 is going to be 2.5 billion Africans. Are we thinking about that? Are Africans thinking about that? Is anybody thinking about that other than the rules-based order, which is thinking about how the hell they're going to survive, and they're going to, without manipulation and increase in the death rate of Africans. So that's the problem. We all have the actual same exact common interest. And that's what President Xi has been saying of China. And the West refuses to hear it. He says the words and they say, it's propaganda, it's propaganda. Well, what about if he really means it? What about if he really believes there's a shared common interest of mankind? Nah, that's just a communist dictator. Well, China did bring 700 million people out of poverty. Maybe as capitalists, we should look at that. Maybe we can learn something. Nah, they did it by dictatorship. Well, how does dictatorship lead to creativity of economic development? But the problem is the prejudice is there. Every day I read various articles on Africa, as well as I've been involved in American politics since I was 17. The demonstrations that they're having in New York City today and bring up the moral issue for defense of Palestine, I was on exactly those campuses in 1968 and 69 against the war in Vietnam. So we are now in a period where there is a potential for a moral issue to be brought in front of the society by young people. But that's not going to be sufficient. We have to actually organize countries and leaders to understand that it's in our common interest for us to have a new paradigm based on this economic development, which is in the self-interest of every nation, of every human being. So instead of, I'm not asking the United States to become China or China to become the United States. I'd rather live in the United States personally. I love this place with all its faults. But nevertheless, we have a common interest. So what is blocking us from seeing the fact that we can work with every nation in the world? We don't have to have an axis of evil. If we have countries that are misbehaving, then we work with them and make offers to them and find ways of inducing them to change for the better. But you don't attack them. I mean, this idiocy that you see today, I mean, Israel's another example. We're not going to have peace with Hamas. They're the enemy. Well, who else do you ever have peace with but the enemy? If you don't need a peace treaty with your friends. So this idea that we only have enemies and that the world is fundamentally made up of people, but those people do not have the power to change and to be creative. And the key thing we have to do in the rules-based order is figure out how to manipulate them. How do we manipulate them so we remain on top? But the rejection of expansion, the rejection of transformation, the rejection of growth is what's killing the world right now by the so-called rules-based order. I say so-called because I don't find anything in the rules that resembles order. But the fact of the matter is, that's why we haven't had any policies for development. And as I said earlier on in my presentation, development as a concept doesn't exist. Think about it. In the last 100 years, let's start from the 1920s, when the Royal Institute of International Affairs was created. They began putting together their network for the Anglo-American establishment. In the last 100 years, starting, let's say, with Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, that's a little bit earlier, that's 1912, to the current period, we've had two presidents who have actually conducted a foreign policy for the development of Africa and saw it to be in the self-interest of the United States. One, Franklin Roosevelt. With all his limitations, including physical limitations, because I think he only was in Africa once or twice, Liberia and Morocco, I guess, he saw the potential of development. He said we could turn the whole desert into green vegetation. We just have to bring water here, water there. He was already thinking about it as he flew over the desert. And he wanted to work with African nations. And African nations looked up to Roosevelt, the Atlantic Charter of 1941, which was formed off the coast of you guys up there in Canada. This was an ideal for the African nations to look at the Atlantic Charter. And it was in their interest that it said in there that there will not be imperial powers controlling your resources. It wasn't just meant for Germany, it was meant for the world. And then the second president we had was a follower of Roosevelt, explicit follower of Roosevelt, which was John F. Kennedy. And when he came into office, there's a very good book, which was, I didn't even know existed until recently. Who told me about it? I'm forgetting her name, who runs this very popular talk show. Mel. She told me about the book, and it's betting on the Africans. And Kennedy came into office, John F. Kennedy, with a whole new approach to winning over the Africans. because he saw it morally, politically, and economically as beneficial in the United States. Now, he was still in the environment of the Cold War. In some sense, he was a Cold Warrior, but he didn't want to destroy the world. And he saw the potential of African development. And he reached out to Kwame Nkrumah and worked with Kwame Nkrumah. And it was very difficult at various times, acrimonious relationship, because they couldn't control Kwame Nkrumah, which is probably a good thing. But he intervened internationally to make sure there was the funding for the Volta Dam project, which was an energy project and smelting of bauxite into aluminum. And it stands there today. It's still the biggest power source in Ghana, which is kind of sad after almost 60 years. It was finished in 1966. And there's a plaque there in honor of John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy reached out to many different leaders. And there's another book, The Ordeal of JFK, I think it's called. And it has a picture on the front of Kennedy in pain, physically in pain. He was caught by a photographer in the room when he heard about the death of Patrice Lumumba. He heard about it a month late, and he was pained by it. So we've had two presidents in 110 years who've had a foreign policy that understands the importance of the development of this very unique continent. So where do we stand today? Well, the only interest that the United States has had, and they don't admit this publicly, but I've been told by enough people privately, by people in the government, some intelligence people, I've got enough confirmation of this. Our policy towards Africa is motivated by stopping China and Russia. And you see that every one of these papers. Oh, look at Russia. They're moving into Niger, which was our biggest military base in West Africa and in the Sahel. And they are moving in. And the Nigerians have asked us to move out. They have asked us to leave. $110 million drone base and 1,000 troops. And they told us to get out. And the Russians are moving in. So there's huge articles written by people, I know some of them, they're not very profound. And what do they say? Oh, look at Russia, look at Russia. And I'm saying to myself, how stupid can you be? Look at what we did to create the conditions that they want to kick us out. And it's not very hard to figure out. 3% of Nigerians have electricity. That's all you need to know. What else is there to know? But the fact of the matter is they rant and rail about China. They rant and rail about Russia. And they don't see that their rules-based order axioms prevent them from understanding the importance of development. And that's why they're failing. And that's why they will always fail. They may try to prevent anyone else from succeeding, but they can't succeed because of this axiomatic hatred of the human beings and the nations of human beings. So we have on the continent today, we have leaders who are making efforts, such as I read the speeches, some comments from the president of Uganda, president of Tanzania, Natalie Pandora of South Africa, and there are many others who are fighting, for example, that the right to use their own energy. There's another wonderful South African, the energy secretary, Montage. I may be pronouncing his name wrong. Pete, he probably knows the better way to say it. But he said, we're going to use coal. We're going to use all forms of energy. We're not going to be subject to colonialism anymore because the rules-based order says, no, no, no. You can't use these hydrocarbon fuels. They're bad. We're going to destroy the planet. You Africans are going to destroy the planet if you use fuel. Of course, the rest of the world is using these. You know, Germany is actually importing or mining coal, and they don't have a lot of it. I think South Africa is some of the most in the world. So there's people standing up across the whole continent. There's people rejecting the rules-based order, but they're not powerful enough yet, and by themselves, to win the war. What they can do is they can resist the total control of the rule-based order. And they're in energy, I think they're going to resist it all the way, because they've now come to the conclusion they must have energy or their citizens are going to die and their nations are going to fail. There's also, as was gone through last week, a great deal of work being done on railroads. Some of it very exciting. Other areas not moving so fast. There are plans. There are people thinking in these directions. And we here, we've got to do everything we can to challenge and change this anti-human rule-based order, because, as I said, it can't win, but it can bring everybody down. And the fact that they've been kicked out of a few countries in Sahel, even though I don't know exactly the direction that the coup leaders are going to take their country, the fact that the West was kicked out, France and the United States, especially the United States, because it's not hard for Africans to hate France, given what they've done, the French. But they're kicking out the United States, and the United States should see that and say to themselves, well, why did that happen? How did that happen? What did we do? And what could we do to change it? But then they'd be thinking. Then they'd be creative. Then they'd be self-reflexive about their thought process. And that's not what they're going to do. So we have to build a coalition around the world of a new system of politics, economics, and security, because the rules-based order is not going to succeed. But the weakness of their failure gives us the opportunity to bring something better and new into existence. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Larry. That was quite a tour de force. Very comprehensive, and I'm sure there's lots of questions because you touched on a lot of different areas in this important subject. Myself, I had a question regarding the Nigerian currency devaluation that you were talking about. Okay, so how does this actually work? How did this currency get devaluated that much? What roles come into play for something like that to happen?
Well, it starts with the fact that I don't think there's any African currencies that are considered acceptable outside of Africa. So all these currencies are inadequate for foreign exchange. In other words, you can't pay your bills with these currencies. You have to get yen or yuan or pounds or dollars. And what's happened is that these countries, because of their poor terms of trade and the limited products they produce, their currencies are artificially driven down. And so that there's not an acceptance of the rates keep going lower, because people now will say, well, we're not going to accept so many naira to dollar. It's going to have to be this much more and this much more. And so people find that with the amount of naira they have, they can't buy the same product. So they have to have more naira to buy this product, which comes from outside the country. So the currency begins to slide even before it's officially devalued. And what the IMF says is, look, you're going to have to carry out an official devaluation. They're threatening Ethiopia with that right now. You're going to have to carry out an official devaluation, because if you want our help, you're going to have to change your macroeconomic policy of your country. Macroeconomic policy, not development, not economic growth. And therefore, if you want loans to come in from the World Bank or other Western banking systems and consortiums, then we're not going to do that unless you lower your currency, because that's the only way you're going to get control, according to them, of your macro economy. Yes, it will mean suffering. Yes, it will mean death. Yes, it will mean your country will be poor, but it will get stronger because you're taking these measures in dealing with an unhealthy economy and making it stronger, according to their free trade. So this was the first evaluation of Nigeria. Was after Buhari was couped. He was in there for 18 months about. He was couped out of office in January 1985. And the guy who comes in, Babangida, the first thing he does is he carries out a massive devaluation of the currency, an end to infrastructure, and end to economic subsidy. These were called the Structural Adjustment Program, SAPs. So it was official. So the Naira immediately, where it was worth $1.34, when Babangida came in, it was now worth, well, 25 to the dollar. It was worth 4 cents. How about that for an evaluation? And then it just continued because the economies were weak, and the people who supplied products to the economies and the people who provided loans could demand that they had to provide more of their currency because it no longer, according to them, had the value. Now, devaluation is something you may do under extreme circumstances as part of an overall reorganization process, but it's a killer. And it's a killer for your people, because immediately it means if you now have 500 Naira to the dollar, which was the case about 3-4 years ago. I think it was after I left there. So let's say you have 400 Naira to the dollar. It's about what it was. Now it's 1,000. So your Naira is worth half of what it was. Your savings, your pay. You still have to pay your rent, but the amount of money you have to pay in now is increased in Naira. So devaluation is a very vicious means of destroying an economy, and the world banking system gets away with it because they can make these demands because these economies do not produce manufacturing wealth and therefore are totally dependent on importing and trading at the mercy of the international financial system. But it's going to be brutal. If this devaluation goes through in Ethiopia, it's going to be really brutal. And what is it about? And what can it can increase destabilization, because then a lot of people all of a sudden became much poorer. And they say, well, we got to get rid of this government now. We just got really poor. So it's a vicious, manipulative move, this devaluation of currencies. But they have no trading capability. When you leave an African country, I have Naira, I have Zimbabwe money, forget that. I have Sudanese money, which has been devalued. I have the birr, which is Ethiopian money. And I have it in my drawer, but I can't do a thing with it except when I go into those countries. And this has been a way that they've kept these countries down.
Okay, thank you for that. It's kind of overwhelming. I have 5 people lined up right now for questions. Again, if you want to ask Larry a question, please put it in the chat box. You can just simply say, I have a question, or you can actually write your question. So first I have PD Lawton. PD, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Lawrence. I think that was absolutely fantastic overview of the situation of the African continent. Absolutely brilliant. I know you've already covered it, wrote that message and sent it off, and you covered the subject a few minutes later. But to address the energy needs and the energy deficit, I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on that, and to say how, in your opinion, do renewables and green energy come into that, please?
Sure, be happy to. The question of energy is so central to an economy. As I say, nothing really can take place without electricity. I was thinking about during the COVID crisis, when there were even vaccines that were Some were being manufactured in Africa, others were being shipped in. But there had to be, many of them, or one set of the vaccines had to be kept at a very cold temperature. But how do you do that without electricity? I mean, every facet of production requires abundant electricity, and smelting processes, for example, which you take your ore and you turn it into a metal, that takes intense forms of energy. And yet, the African country is the most energy deficit, African continent is the most energy deficit continent in the world. There's no place else where half the people on the continent do not have access to electricity. So if you were really concerned about democracy and human rights and growth, then you would say, well, we got to build electricity like crazy, any way we can. Now, nuclear energy, as some of us know, is the best form of energy, and you can take other energy forms in transition to get to nuclear energy. But my rough calculations I did a few years ago is Africa needed about 1,600 gigawatts of electrical power to catch up to the Western world. And sub-Saharan Africa has under 100,000 megawatts. So you can see the deficit is huge. It's gigantic. It's hard to contemplate. Therefore, you would take every step you could to build energy. Now, solar energy can light bulbs, and you can use it to charge your phone if you have enough sunlight. But you're never going to power an industrial economy with such a diffuse form of energy. It's just not going to happen. So you really need higher energy flux density, more powerful forms of heat per square area. Nuclear is the best. So you want to get to that as soon as you can. But coal is better than solar and windmills. Hydro is better. Gas is better. And Africa is filled with the largest amount of natural resources of hydrocarbon fuels in the world. We think there may be some cases in parts of Russia that have comparable levels. I'm not sure. But Africa has enormous amounts of natural resources. To dictate, as a rules-based order does, with its total commitment to life, so-called, to dictate to African countries, you can't use your resource. You can't use your coal, which South Africa has abundant. You can't use your oil and gas, which Nigeria has abundant, as other countries do. This is a death knell. This is the greatest form of dictatorship against life by the rules-based order, is the denial of countries to build their own, use their own resources to produce electricity. And it's a complete hypocritical, because we know the West is doing this. But nevertheless, in Africa, they're told you can't do it. You have to be responsible for, quote, saving the planet, even if it means your people suffer. I mean, what utter nonsense. And the thing is a fraud. It's a total fraud. And I gave the example of the fraud earlier. I didn't call it a fraud. Look at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Hydropower, 5,150 megawatts of water that flows down from Lake Tana over the falls, which I went to. I've been on Lake Tana, then I went to the falls, winds its way down to the dam. And you've seen pictures from my visits there on my website. Why doesn't the West support this large amount of renewable energy? I mean, it's renewable, the water just keeps flowing until we have a severe weather problem, drought problem, because they're frauds. You would think they would actually make this a highlight. Oh, look what Ethiopia's doing. They're using renewable energy. No, because they don't want the energy. They're not interested in African nations having energy. Now, people say to me, how can you say that? It's so harsh. Well, goes back to what we just discussed a little while ago. That's the rules-based order. They don't believe in the noble quality of human life because they don't believe in the creative mind. And this guy, Montashe, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he's another great South African, in my view, because he says, no, we're not going to listen to this new, he called it a new form of colonialism. That's a lot of guts. He said, there's a new form of colonialism, this environmentalism. We're going to use our resources. We're not going to listen. And it's not just him making the argument. There was an energy conference last year, right, where some great speeches were made as well. So this is part of the resistance that's building up against the New World, against the rules-based order. It's building up. On the energy question, I think they're going to wage a real fight because they know that this is life and death of their people, of their nation. And they're not, I don't think, or at least a number of them are not going to give in. They're going to stand and fight on this issue. In the West, the rules-based order has very little to offer. Even in their own terms, they said we're going to put $100 billion into Africa to offset the fact that they haven't had a chance to develop their fossil fuels. And I think they gave out $8 billion. So they don't even deliver on any of the I mean, there's so many levels of fraud to this whole environmental movement. And my answer is very clear, that the environment, as I've studied it, the climate has been changing for 4 billion years. It's not being sped up by human beings. And I'm a nature person. I mean, I hike several hundred miles a year, and I camp out in the woods by myself for weeks at a time. So I enjoy the environment. But I'm a human being, and human beings can change the environment and can make improvements. And I'm happy to see every time one of these leaders of African nations challenge the rules-based order on this energy question. And my answer, which angers many of my friends and relatives, is my advice to African countries: burn every lump of coal you can, every meter of gas, every liter of oil. Burn it and build energy for your people and improve their standard of living. And don't listen to these rule-based order criminals.
Could I just add to that, Lawrence, that, in the case of South Africa, that Gwede Mantashe, the minister that you're talking about, he, in not so many words, said that South Africa's sovereignty in terms of energy was being undermined through the green energy policies, which are essentially Eurocentric, aren't they? Mm-hmm. They're certainly not Afrocentric. And, when you think in terms of foreign investment to a country like South Africa that is undergoing a power crisis, that is sabotage of the economy. That's economic hitmen sabotaging the economy of South Africa by obstructing the use of coal, which is 80% of South Africa's electricity is from coal. So, our Eurocentric energy masters come along and say you can no longer burn coal. Their economy goes into free fall. Well, it hasn't gone into free fall, but that's what they'd like to see. And the foreign investment stops because the factories can't run.
Right.
And everything else can't run. So, yeah, I would totally agree with you. Thank you so much for your answer.
Well, PD, I don't know if you agree with this, because you follow Africa pretty closely. My view is that this may be a line of resistance that the Africans are not going to give in on, because it's a little life and death. I mean, I've seen more fight back on the energy question in Africa than I've seen on any other issue. So I'm hoping, but I don't know, is that your evaluation also, that this may be the line that can't cross anymore?
I can see a lot of room for hope. I'm trying to remember the name of the Nigerian, I think he was the previous vice Vice Prime Minister or possibly Prime Minister, but he said something excellent about the green energy
That's
policies.
right. The vice president.
You probably know who I mean.
Yeah, I can't remember his name.
Yeah, Obasanjo.
Yeah,
Obasanjo, possibly. But I think one must add into that conversation that, of course, they're being bribed. So the African governments are being bribed to go into the green energy policy system. They're being given substantial amounts of cash to do so, and that's where the problem lies, because you'll have a government that'll want to quick fix the holes in the economy with the green money, the green cash. And I do happen to know Kenya has done that, and they therefore won't invest in any other than renewable sources of energy, which, of course, as you already said, cannot run base load on a grid, on a national grid. They cannot produce electricity 24/7. So, yeah, I think there's room for hope, but I think they're being bribed.
but of course, what works in our favor on that, PD, is the fact that they can't even come up with the money that they promised these countries. So they can't even provide the bribe money that they want to. So there's another hole in their operation.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, PD, for your input. Next we have Richard. Richard had a comment. Maybe he also have a question, who knows? Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Well, thank you, Lawrence. That was very informative. I'm very optimistic about Africa, because the rules-based order is rapidly declining, and Russia and China are very serious about the multipolar order and BRICS. South Africa, of course, was one of the original BRICS members, and Ethiopia is either already joined or is joining.
Just joined.
The pattern seems to be that China's coming in, providing the kind of developmental support that you talk about and that we all want. They're very serious about it, where it's not extractive, it's win-win, you know. And then Russia is providing the security assistance, like already in Niger, where the French, through not trying, were making no success against the terrorist groups. With Russian consulting with the Niger army, they're already winning battles, you know, with the terrorists that are trying to destabilize things. So I feel good about what's going to be happening. On the other hand, the United States, you know, I think the only place the rule-based order is going to still be is in the West itself. You know, it's like the IMF hitmen that were roaming the third world now, you know, they are now hitting us. That's what 2008 was all about, was structural adjustment programs on the West. So anyway, that's my comment, and thank you very much.
Well, I would say that what you reference is a potential change in dynamic. But you look at the BRICS, which is now 10. I think Argentina dropped out, and Ethiopia was one of the new members. That they're still very small, but they're a potential, and they have a totally different set of axioms. And because the whole global South doesn't gain much from the rules-based order, this small leadership of the BRICS, with of course China, which is not small, this is a new potential. And even though it's a small potential, it can change the entire way the world operates. China, I mean, did make major investments. Now that has dropped off considerably. I think last year it went way down, and the year before went down, but I think last year was the lowest in 2 decades. So it's not going to be a panacea, the Chinese, but we have to put together a combination of countries, and China is certainly going to be the biggest one, outside of the rule-based order, that can set up a structure for promoting real economic growth. I mean, the fastest way to end poverty and hunger in Africa, and I made this proposal to the United States Institute for Peace 10 years ago when I was there, is if the United States and China were to adopt as a mission the elimination of hunger and food in Africa. But the United States obviously has said no, no, no to development in Africa. So we're going to have to find another way to put together a combination where we can make these kind of investments in infrastructure, which the needs are huge. I mean, they're just sometimes mind-boggling, the figures of infrastructure investment that Africa needs. So that's going to be a challenge. And I think China's maybe not going to play the role it has in the past in the same way. So we'll have to figure things out. But the dynamic is going in the right direction.
Thank you. Next up is Russell. Russell, are you there?
Yep, yes, I am here.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, fascinating, fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. I suppose I'm from Zimbabwe, actually, so I was very interested to see the Chinese influence in Zimbabwe and the discussion that us Zimbabweans have had about the Chinese involvement in the Zimbabwean economy, which has been increasingly extensive. And I suppose I'm just inviting some conversation on what is the difference between the Chinese involvement in African economies and the Western colonial or banking sort of involvement. And there's a fear that's often discussed that in the long term, that the Chinese would start to demand some kind of return in terms of political power and as to what's been going on. And it's this whole idea of win-win. I have sort of been listening to these programs a lot, so I understand where that's coming from, and that it's a completely different, how can I put it, a political system, whereas the Western system might be seen as a feudal one. But it's still somehow, how can I put it, difficult to believe this win-win, that somehow there can be a completely different paradigm. And I wondered if there's any way of measuring those impacts over the last 20 years. Could we sort of compare the two systems? Have we seen the Western colonial system ebbing a little bit? I suppose we have, but I was wondering whether there's any economic indicators or any ways of evaluating these two different systems.
Well, I mean,
thank you.
If you look at the investment, if you look at the trade between China and Africa, I think it's about 278 to 280 billion, it's in that range. And you look at the trade between the United States, in particular, not all of the West, but the United States and Africa, and it's about 50, 60 billion. So it's really the Chinese trade with African nations is zoomed, and the US trade with African nations has really declined. And there's no reason to indicate it's going to change on that level. I think the Chinese do want a return on their loans, even some of the loans are concessional loans, some are not. But they do want a return. I don't think they're in a position just to give the money. But on the other hand, their approach is to work with each nation, nation by nation, to find a solution if the African nation is not paying its loan. In other words, all this absolute lies. I mean, it just goes back to this old theory of they say Goebbels says you just keep telling the big lie over and over again. I mean, the United States, they dug up this lie made by some idiot that China was going to take over the controlling resources or assets or projects of their loans to African countries if they didn't meet their payments. And of course, it never was true. And some of my friends repeated this. And I said, well, give me the country. Tell me which country China has taken over their assets, or what project they've taken over for failure to pay the loan on it. And of course, none existed. And Chinese debt ranges as low as 12%, which is interesting. That figure comes from Chatham House, as high as 17%. And then some people don't know any better, say 20%. So that's the range of how much debt African nations owe to China as part of total debt. So where's the rest of the 80+%? It's Western investors. It's private sector, it's hedge funds, it's the Paris Club, it's the IMF, etc. So there never was, nor would the Chinese even, why would they want to have control of projects in Africa? I mean, they're interested in building up their political economic base. They're not going to control something that that's physically is not under their control, thousands of miles away. But nevertheless, this was used to bash China, and people repeated it. I mean, I was infuriated. Biden repeats it, Blinken repeats it, congressman, congresswoman. And I'm saying, you damn idiots, you know it's not true. Are you that stupid? But yet, that was repeated to bash China. The problem is, you still have the dominance of the world system is the Western financial system, Paris, London, US. But that is weakening, and that's the good news. The fact is it doesn't have the kind of complete hegemony it had in the past. It's still in more control and bigger than what we're seeing, but the dynamic is in favor of the global South. And China makes the global South much bigger than just any other country. So that's what I look for, is I look for changes in potential, not what's in the here and now. And the global South can have the potential to move in a direction that establishes a different kind of economic financial system, and with a different concern and a different paradigm. And the BRICS is very clear. I think it's in the statement of the BRICS somewhere. They exist for the purpose of development. Exactly the words that you don't hear coming from the West. Now, the West is reacting. It took them a while, but they are reacting. And they now realize that they can't just order African nations to obey them. They can, but they know they're not going to listen all the time. And they can't simply tell African nations not to trade with China. Although Blinken just came back from China and told China not to trade with Russia. So the West, the rules-based orders still think they can rule, but they have now come to a conclusion in Africa that can't just attack Russia and China, even though that is the heart of the policy. That was the basis of the African Summit in 2022, and it's the basis of the policy now. So they've come up with this program called the Global Infrastructure Investment Fund, GIIF. We're supposed to be Europe and the United States coming up with $600 billion for investment in infrastructure in the developing sector around the world. And the United States is supposed to come up with $200 billion. But I've not been able to figure out, I've gone to seminars on this in Washington, what is the form of this money? I don't think it's going to be long-term credit. I think it's going to be insurance-backed loans or guarantees. I'm not sure. I doubt if the West is ever going to come up with that much money for actual credit. But their big counterattack, which is early on, we have to see where it goes, and I know PD is also following this, is the Lobito corridor. They put on paper a very big investment for infrastructure rail from essentially one end to the other, not quite, but from Zambia, DRC, all the way across to this very large and unused port, Lobito, in Angola on the eastern side. Now they're still in the phase of feasibility study. This is not going to happen, but it's the first sign that I've seen that the West has realized they can't just order and talk. So whether this is actually realized or not and how productive it is, it's still based on commodity resources, extraction, although they have a big section on manufacturing. At least it's a recognition by the rules-based order that they have to respond to what China has done in Africa. So that's a good thing that they've had to respond. Whether it's a viable project or not, it's too early to tell. So I think, as we say, in the long arc of history and justice in the world, the dynamic of the global South is definitely progressing, but the West is still in charge and still very dangerous. So now Zimbabwe is another interesting example. I used to work with Zimbabweans quite a bit 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But they're still under sanctions. They removed one set of sanctions, and the West didn't like the election of Mnangagwa again. So they sanctioned him and his wife and 9 other leaders of the country. So Zimbabwe has been under sanctions now for about 24 years. When Mugabe, who I didn't agree with on everything, but he was a nationalist. He stood against the West for Zimbabwe, despite whatever other problems he had. And when they transferred the land, which had been held by the Rhodesians, the best land, 70% of the best land in Zimbabwe, and they transferred it back to the Black Zimbabweans, the West went into a full court sanctions, denying them access to funds all over the world. And they bragged about how unsuccessful Zimbabwe was once they took the land. The inference was these Black Zimbabweans don't know how to run a farm, and us white guys were kicked out. So then they finally lifted those sanctions, I believe, and then they now have sanctions against 11 individuals. So it's, again, this is meant to chill any investment in Zimbabwe when you're sanctioning the president by the West. On the other hand, though, Zimbabwe is potentially the breadbasket of the southern part of Africa. I mean, it's got a huge amount of unused fertile land. Of course, the minerals, as much as Cecil Rhodes tried to tie them all up, he couldn't even find them all. There's so much wealth in minerals in Zimbabwe that he couldn't figure them all out. So between its land and its minerals, it's a very rich country. And if the United States and the West wasn't so stupid, we would develop this country and develop this region. And it could become you have a potential breadbasket in Sudan, you have a potential breadbasket in Zimbabwe. And of course, the Congo, I mean, you're only using 4 to 5% of the land, and most of it's not irrigated. So you have the potential all over them. There's enough water, you move some of it around. There's the most fertile land in the world, uncultivated, still in Africa. So my view is we can eliminate hunger. We don't want to, but we can. Just using standard agricultural methods. We've used them in the United States. We've used them in Europe. They've worked for hundreds of years. We know how to grow food, and we don't want food to be grown in Africa. And that's the sad story. And Zimbabwe could play a big positive role if we wanted to really help the continent.
It's kind of the old slaveholder mentality from the South, right? With having these gigantic farms in Zimbabwe that are actually owned by people sitting in England and in the United States. And so they're saying, oh yeah, Blacks don't know how to farm. And in the other side, they are running their farms. So they do know how to farm. It's just that you don't want them to grow food. Yes, exactly. I think Russell had a little follow-up. I'm letting you in again, Russell. So, okay. Because there are other people who have questions, but you said you had a follow-up.
Oh, you mean Richard?
No, Richard, I'm sorry. Yes, there is Richard. Sorry about that.
Oh, the question of China wanting to get something back. I think Russia and China, they're playing a long game, like with the Belt and Road Initiative and whatever they're doing in Africa. And the idea is if you can wake up a country economically, get it going, get some infrastructure in there, then as it develops, then there's going to be investment opportunities and trade opportunities. And I think they're saying, wake up, world, and we'll trade with you and we'll all get better off. I think so. I see their return is not interest on their loans, and that they have to do that, but it's really a long-term thing. And also, just a side comment is, I think if you take China, India, Iran, South Africa, all the BRICS countries, I think you have not only more population than the West, but I think you even have more economic GDP. So I don't think it is small.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Irene, you next. Irene, are you there? You have your mute on, Irene.
I'm here.
Okay, perfect.
First of all, thank you very much for this extremely precious overview and presentation. Very, very important. My question has been mostly answered. I have been asking myself, how is it possible? How is it possible that the so-called rules-based order is able to pressure the richest countries, as you mentioned, full of natural resources and theoretically sovereign countries to follow the dictates? But you have been more or less answering my question, but especially with the case of South Africa, I wonder what means do they have? Like now, after South Africa went forward with this initiative at the JCA in favor of Gaza, and now they are pressuring even more, we learn. But how exactly? Can you give perhaps an example? How are they going about it? Well, to pressure a nation like South Africa, which has some, development, haven't they? They have some industry. They have even nuclear power.
Yes. Well, I had an interesting discussion with some officials from South Africa a few years ago, and they recognized that the revolution that took place in South Africa that allowed the Black population to run their country and vote was a political revolution, but they did not carry out a full economic revolution. And in fact, there's an interesting book I have it on my bookshelf. A friend of mine, Dave Cherry, recommended to me once. And the people who ran South Africa, which are the great mineral financial cartels, they knew at a certain point they couldn't control the country anymore. The Afrikaners couldn't control the country. So they looked for that plan A and plan B. And they realized they would have to give up a certain amount of political control. Otherwise, the lack of cohesion and chaos and conflict in the country would destroy it. So they knew that the Afrikaners had to give up a certain amount of political power. But they didn't give up, and this policy was run by top financial people who realized this. And they gave the go-ahead for certain contacts to start talking to each other in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Certain people were talking to Mandela in South Africa. Other people were talking to Tambo in England. But they never gave up financial control. So you still have a great deal of the wealth in South Africa is owned by the City of London. That square mile of financial commodity houses. They don't own all their land, and they don't own all the resources under their land, which a lot of this wealth is. And they still control a great deal of the finances in South Africa. And that's where the pressure is. Mm-hmm. Now, that's why this guy, Malema, who's left the ANC and formed his own economic freedom party, I think. That's why he gets traction, and he gets legitimate traction because he is railing against this control of outsiders of sovereign African wealth. And that's going to be a factor in this election. He's much more outspoken on this than either the current president, Ramaphosa, or the former president, Zuma, who has also formed his own party. But the goal of the West right now is to make sure that the ANC does not get 50% of the vote. And don't forget, the ANC, since they elected Mandela in 1994, have always gotten more. Now their vote has been decreasing, but it's always been over 50%. So the one goal is to get the ANC under 50%. So they'd have to form a coalition. And then they've never had a coalition government before. And they want the DA, which is the more white party, to play a role in that coalition. But they also want to get Ramaphosa out. That's another part of the deal, is to get him eliminated. Now, who they would want to put in as president, I don't know. But again, P.D. Lawton and I have mentioned two people in the Ramaphosa government, Montasha and Pandur, who are exceptional. And they obviously want to remove their influence as well. But the outside commodity cartels, people like Rio Tinto Zinc, Anglo American, I'm forgetting Anglo Gold maybe, they still control a certain portion of a large portion of the wealth in South Africa. And so it was an uncompleted revolution. They did the political revolution, but they didn't have either the foresight or most likely they didn't have the power to challenge the financial oligarchy in 1990s. And therefore, this problem has been lingering for 30 years, even though South Africa does have the most probably industry, has a nuclear power plant, but there have been all kinds of problems in running their electricity. So they're really suffering badly. And there's probably been a lot of decent people who have left South Africa because the economy has been so challenging. So this election, which is going to be at the end of this month, on the 29th of May, is going to be potentially a big game-changing election for South Africa.
In which sense?
Well, I'm not on the inside. I only have certain contacts. But if the Anglo-Americans' rules-based order get what they want, which is bringing the ANC under majority rule, 50%, and knocking Ramaphosa out, which I think is their intention, then we can only expect the worst. That's who they're going to try to replace them with, and that they would use a coalition to try to disrupt whatever positive progress and positive orientation that South Africa had. So it could be a severe weakening of their position in leadership in the global South. At least that's the intention of what the rules-based order would want.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if PD agrees with that or not, but that's what I'm thinking at the moment.
No, I certainly do, Lawrence, and I just wanted to add into what you were saying that one of the things Zuma came out with, former President Jacob Zuma, was he gave such an excellent, he had to monitor what he was saying and be diplomatic. Obviously, he couldn't come out and say it exactly as it is. He said that the money is there. So the money is there in the Reserve Bank. But what happens is you have the Anglo-American entity controls who is the governor, who is the treasurer. So they control the treasury. So government can approach and say, look, we need X amount of rands to build a new factory somewhere, or to make an investment in transformative infrastructure or whatever it is to do, manufacturing. But then you have this issue where government comes up against a wall where the bank will not release the credit. Mm-hmm. And that's very critical, because that we understand is how the banking system now functions and IMF functions. So I think that was another critical thing. But also people tend to overlook the fact that South Africa has its own Rockefeller family, as it were, and they're called the Oppenheimers. And the Oppenheimers have owned the resources, the gold and the diamonds, for over a century. But I think Magdalena's talk was so excellent, and she explained how the Milner groups, the British influence infiltrated through Rhodes. And I think to go to Magdalena's talk and to understand that countries are manipulated in ways that one can really not even dream of, because, you know, Chatham House, and that's the king of the rules-based order. So I think that's all I would add, but I would agree with you, Lawrence, totally. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Petey. Yeah, so my talk is on the Rising Tide Foundation. It's 2 parts, and it's the Boer War. So you can see that whole history right there. Okay, Jerry, you're next on the list. You have a question about Sudan.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Larry. That was an excellent presentation for us. I wanted to ask about Sudan. I know you said you were going to talk mainly on sub-Saharan Africa, but you know, with the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza getting most of people's attention, the kind of what's happening in Sudan kind of flies under the radar most of the time. And for myself, I remember a while ago reading articles about how Russia had made an agreement with Sudan, and they were going to make a port in Sudan, Port Sudan, I think, on the Red Sea. And I thought, well, that'd be a great idea. That would help development. Okay, I'm for that. And then next thing I know, there's a war in Sudan, and there's not going to be any port. So in my mind, I just said, you know, the simple idea is that, well, the rules-based order people didn't want Sudan cozying up to Russia, so they just started a war to blow this thing up. I don't think that's the whole reason there's a war, but I'm sure it's a part of it. And so anyway, when I'm looking on the internet and reading other stuff, you know, everyone does this thing. I do it sometimes myself too. You want to divide the world into the good guys and the bad guys, and we want to be for the good guys and cheer the good guys. And I don't think Sudan is the situation there is that simple. I think it's more complicated. And so I was just wondering if you had an idea of how peace could come to Sudan, or maybe I know you've made trips to Africa, and I think you've made a trip to Sudan. We over here, we don't get to see how the Africans are thinking. What do the Africans think is a way to have peace in Sudan? I don't know if you've had talks about that, but I would really enjoy to hear your comments on the situation there, if you could. Thank you.
Yeah, Sudan is a tough case. I mean, Sudan is in sub-Saharan Africa, and they have the port has been built. It's many years ago, Port Sudan. It's up in the northern end along the Red Sea. The Russian agreement with them was to build a military base. That's what they were looking to do. And I don't know, to be honest with you, I haven't gone back to that question. I don't know where that stands, but that was the idea, was to build a military base. And the port is in the northern section, so you can find it easily. It's I believe it's on the Red Sea. The problem in Sudan, as I say, most of these situations, they don't just pop up in the here and now. They have histories to them. And I've probably been in and out of Sudan 10 times. I don't remember the last time I was there. It was sometime in the late teens of 2016, 17, 18. I can't remember. But the problem in Sudan was that there was a group that was run by a guy named Al-Turabi. I met him a few times. He passed away. And he was essentially the head, I believe, of the Islamic grouping. I don't know, Islamic Conference. I'm not sure the name they called themselves. And he had a bunch of people he worked with. And one of them was this Omar al-Bashir. And they carried out a bloodless coup in 1989. And bloodless. And no one got killed. There was no fighting. And he was a nationalist of types. I met him a few times. There were people much worse than him, but he was a nationalist and he was a consensus candidate of this Islamic conference, which probably was affiliated with the Islamic Brotherhood. And once he came to power in '89, the United States and the West just went out to destroy Sudan and him. They issued this very harsh sanctions. And then there was the war in Darfur, as it's called, where, well, before the war in Darfur, there was under George Bush in the early 200s, Sudan government, that is the Bashir government, agreed to allow an election in southern Sudan. So Sudan could vote if it wanted to leave Sudan. Now, up to that point, Sudan was the largest country in Africa. And it also had the largest agricultural potential. I'm thinking over 50 million acres of unused but fertile land. That land was never developed. Again, no policy for development, zero. Even though it was the biggest asset, if anyone was thinking how to build up a country, help them build this agriculture and they could feed the continent. This was in the 70s. But after he took power, all this, Bashir took power, they went after a destabilization of Sudan. And there was a group of people in the United States, former Congressman Payne from New Jersey, who died many years ago, a guy named John Pendergrass, and a few others. Susan Rice was involved. And they were plotting since the early 1980s for the overthrow of Bashir, who took power, I guess it was 1979, I guess he took power. And they were plotting for his overthrow. And they wanted a separated South Sudan. And they fought and fought and fought to get this. Yeah, that's right. He took power in 1989. They were meeting in the 80s and 90s to get a South Sudan. And eventually, they forced an election. And the agreement of Bashir to hold the election was a concession to the West. And George Bush had planned a major conference for Bashir to celebrate his agreement to have this separate election in Sudan. But then they started the Darfur War. And once the war started, then everything changed. And Bashir was accused of genocide. The conference was canceled. He was then hit with another round of sanctions. And the election took place in 1911, and South Sudan decided to separate from North Sudan. And so—
You mean 2011?
I'm sorry.
Oh,
What did I say?
1911.
Right, 2011. Yeah, it's a little early. 2011. And they separated, but the 75% of all the oil was in South Sudan. North Sudan had built all the pipelines to go to Port Sudan to take the oil out for export. And so the South Sudan were manipulated. The whole election was manipulated. The whole idea of separating the country, I opposed it all over the place, was to weaken and bring down Bashir and his party, the National Congress Party. That was the whole purpose of the separation. And when South Sudan split and had all this oil, these manipulated idiots stopped producing oil to bankrupt the country and to bring the North to its knees. So this is what's going on after 2011, 2012, 2013, et cetera. And then they stir up the democracy movement. And Sudan's leadership was very poor. I met with many people in the leadership of the country and the Congress Party, National Congress Party. They didn't understand anything about economics. And I kept telling them, as long as this kind of poverty exists, you're in danger. And as long as you don't have infrastructure uniting the North and the South, you're in danger. No, 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 we have power. We know how to deal with this. We're in control. You don't realize how strong we are. And of course, they got overthrown, I guess, around 2019. So you have this democracy student movement comes up. It has no plan for economic development. The IMF is squeezing the country. They won't talk to the previous government. Bashir goes to jail, not to the ICC. He's still in jail in Sudan, even though the ICC has declared him a genocidalist. But they don't want to work with any of the previous leaders of the government. All these people running out of the government, hiding, someone put in prison, a friend of mine was put in prison. And the democracy movement just continues, the so-called democracy movement continues the destabilization of the country. So you have a national army, the SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces. But then you have this other guy that Bashir had built up, Hamadet, as another bulwark against change that Bashir wanted a different or additional military capability called the Rapid Response Force. And these two generals of these two armies, when it was time to incorporate the militia into the army, this war broke out, which has now been going on for over a year. And Khartoum, which is a beautiful city, I mean, just gorgeous place on the Nile. I mean, the sunset on the Nile is just something else. And I spent a lot of time in Khartoum. And now the place is destroyed. The war has gone on. Any hope of rebuilding the country is not there. And this all comes out of 35 years since 1989 of trying to weaken this country. And then the West said, oh, look at this is so terrible. These two armies are fighting. Now that the only solution is going to have to come from African nations forcing a meeting beginning with a ceasefire. There has to be a pause in the fighting because the population inside Sudan is getting chewed up, especially Khartoum, and the war is spreading to other parts of the country. So it's a horrible situation. The Africans have been so far unsuccessful at trying to get a peace agreement. In other words, the first thing you have to do is stop the fighting. Then you have to open a humanitarian corridor. Then you have to have a cessation of hostilities to bring the country back together. And the West has no leverage whatsoever. The United States complains, Blinken issues statements, oh, we're going to sanction these people because they're getting money from so-and-so. We're going to sanction us. And no one gives it up anymore because the U.S. has no leverage. The U.S. has no power, has no influence. Some of the Gulf countries are involved. Definitely, UAE is definitely involved. And the African countries are involved. And that's where the solution is going to have to come. It's an ugly, bitter conflict, but it resembles the kind of conflicts you get when you have states collapsing. And the West did everything they could to undermine Sudan. As I said, the leadership was played into it because they didn't think carefully. They had a tin ear to the conditions of life in Sudan, which I knew very well just from walking around the country. But nevertheless, the country was destroyed way before the overthrow in 2019 when they threw out the government and had this democracy youth peace movement coming into power. But they came into power and the IMF was part of it. So they would have meetings where the IMF was there saying, well, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to cut this, you have to cut that. The same thing we discussed in the previous hour of our meeting. There was no vision for how to develop the country. There was no program. Okay, let's get growth going. Let's get agriculture growing. There's a huge potential there. None of that. No thinking of that whatsoever. And therefore, the movement collapsed, and these two generals are now fighting. And this is the pattern. And then the West says, see, we don't have responsible leadership in Africa. Well, you guys helped cause this. As the British would say, bloody hell, you did this. And they did. But no one wants to think long term. So when I start, there's only a few of us who think back 30 years of what's happened to Sudan. So you're not going to find, Jerry, very good information on the internet. It's a real mess. It's hard to separate. I think you have to support the army of the country, but they're not angels either. But this is going to have to be solved by Africans. The West has no leverage in this situation whatsoever. It's very sad. To me personally, I have beautiful pictures and memories of Khartoum, and I hate to see what's going on. But nothing great is going to happen quickly.
Sorry to cut in there, but I think Jerry Lawrence has an excellent article. Your article, Lawrence, on Sudan that Jerry could find. Kick the British out of Sudan.
Oh, many years ago.
Yeah, but it puts everything in perspective.
I think that was 2009 or something, 10, 11, 8. I can't remember when I wrote that.
It is a few years ago. All right. Thanks, Petey. I have Joseph. How much time do you have, Larry?
Well,
I have 2 more questions here on the list.
Okay.
Are you able to do that, or?
Yeah, I could do 2 more. It's in about an hour or 2. My relatives are having a Cinco de Mayo, so I don't want to pass up the sangria.
Yes, absolutely. Cinco de Mayo. That's right. That's today. Okay. All right. Joseph, you're next on the list, please. Yeah.
Hello there. Hello.
Hello.
We can hear.
Oh,
we
yeah.
can hear you, but we can't see you. It's okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It wasn't. I mean, again, I think like last week when I PD, I didn't. It wasn't really a question. It was just a comment that Kissinger's NSM 200, which is, most people have probably heard of, at least in passing, was setting out what Lawrence has been talking about. The idea was to obviously help reduce the population and also to stop them developing so that the West can use all the minerals and resources. That was his report back in 74, I think.
Yeah, 1974.
Yeah. So I was just a comment. I'm sure you were aware of it, but yeah, it just kind of just sort of rings like you wrote it yesterday.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. That was it. That was it. Thanks.
It was a 200-page report, which was declassified in the 1980s, but all you had to do is read the executive summary.
Yeah.
They said, we don't want these countries to develop these resources because they'll deprive the West of them. I mean, it was explicit.
Yeah.
It wasn't hidden in any jargon that was unintelligible.
Yeah. And I think Nigeria was one of the names on the list as well.
And Ethiopia.
Ethiopia as well.
Yeah. I remember the 3 African countries were Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Egypt.
Yeah.
Now, between those 3 countries, you have 450 million people. So the genocide intent did not accomplish its full purpose because they still grew anyway.
Yeah. I just as a passing comment as well, I had a quick look on Wikipedia again just to check some of it, and the head of the discussion about NSM 200 says there's a possibility this isn't a neutral this isn't a neutral link here, so be careful, sort of thing. I was thinking, okay, yeah, it was, yeah. Anyway, thanks very much. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, yeah, that harkens back to some years back. NSSM 200, 2000, yes. 200, isn't it?
Yeah.
200, yes. Okay. Okay, Russell, you had a follow-up question, I believe.
Yeah, thanks for getting back to me. I suppose what I'm feeling is a sort of sense of optimism about the changes that are happening in Africa, and it seems that since the year 2000 or 2003 when I left Zimbabwe, there seems to be a sort of a coherence and a unity in some parts of Africa that I'd kind of lost. I'd become a bit despondent about whether Africa could shake off these shackles that Lawrence has been talking about, and yet we've seen in West Africa, as Lawrence mentioned, a kind of, how can I put it, determination, if I can put it that way, to try to achieve the African Renaissance, which has been spoken about, I think, in the 60s, and then I think Mbeki spoke about it in the 90s, and seemed to recede each time. And so I don't know if I'm putting two and two together and make five, but I'm seeing what Boris Johnson calls the Western hegemony being challenged in Europe, in Ukraine, and at the same time, it seems we are seeing a greater unity in Africa. And I wondered if the two are linked, because I suppose I've in my own experience, I sort of started to become a bit paranoid about the powers of the West to intervene in Africa and to split nations and to trigger civil wars. In other words, to engage in regime change. And I somehow have a kind of sense of optimism now that things have changed. And I think, in my question is this I had a discussion with a Shona friend of mine the other night about this. Are we seeing a new kind of resolve amongst African leadership? Something that maybe you would call a political maturity in post-independence nations? Or are we seeing the old Cold War effect? In other words, that we're seeing maybe a resurgent Russia at being able to face off Western capitalism? I don't know if that question makes sense, but it's what crossed my mind. Yeah.
Well, if we're looking for a definitive, we're winning perspective, I don't think in those terms. I mean, first of all, the fact that the multipolar world exists and the global South exists and expanding, that's a reality. That's the multipolarity and the global South is growing influence. That's not going to be put back in the bottle. That's part of the world right now. And that's part of potential for change in the world right now. And the idea is not to take bets on whether it's going to work or not. The main thing is we have to make it work. We have to contribute to the success. But it's something that's not going to be turned back. I'm very optimistic about the global South. The question on the Africa continent is more difficult, but we have to see it, in my view, as part of this dynamic change of the global South, that they're part of it. I mean, the fact that Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa are part of the BRICS is a big deal. And South Africa is one of the founders of the BRICS. I think there's many other countries, by the way, that want to join the BRICS. At one point, Nigeria did, and they wanted to make it the BRICS, adding the Nigerian N. And then they pulled back, and now I understand they're interested again. But I think there's maybe 20, 30 countries around the world that want to join the BRICS, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a live, living dynamic, the BRICS and the global South. In Africa, what I'm seeing is resistance, more firm resistance. And I see it more around this energy question. And I read you those quotes from Museveni. And now a lot of people say, oh, Museveni, he's been in there forever. He's been a dictator. He has been there forever. But it doesn't undermine what he said and what the president of Tanzania said. And that is, there's many more people saying those things at many more meetings. Therefore, my way of putting it might be that the resistance is growing. the energy question is, I think, the most fighting front that the African countries have, because this idea that you can use your resources to produce electricity is so outrageous that it's hard for anyone to swallow. So they're fighting back on the energy front. They're looking for ways of expanding their influence. I don't know how it's going to go, because it's not like every country has an enlightened leadership. The African Union has very positive plans for the future. I read your 2063 agenda once when I was in Ethiopia, and it's got some really nice stuff in there about the future of energy, the future of rail. Not as aggressive as I'd like to see, but nevertheless, it's positive. But the African Union is not that strong. They actually depend on money from outside the country, or outside in Africa, I think, to fund part of their operation. So question is the leadership there now that's going to make the fight? I mean, I would love to see 5 to 10 African leaders with serious thought and a vision come together and start mapping out plans for the future of Africa. There's a lot of fight going on. There is progress going on. There's progress going on in Tanzania. There's progress going on in Ethiopia. I think there's potential in Ghana. I think there's potential in Cote d'Ivoire. I think there's various pockets of potential. But the Anglo-Americans, the rules-based order, they have a lot of power still in Africa. And as PD went through, they control financial banking operations. They control mineral resources. So I don't want to say, the African Renaissance is now here and it's taken off and it's going to accomplish this, that, and the other. I think there's a resistance building, which is part of a global South resistance, and I consider that very positive. But we have a long way to go, and I think if we had more leaders like Natalie Pandur, I think that would be very positive if we had more leaders of countries with her resolve, her commitment, her intellectual capabilities, and her actually eloquence. I saw her speak twice when she was in Washington, D.C., and had my picture taken with her, which was an honor for me. But I don't see enough Natalie Pandurs yet, but they may be in the process of developing and taking charge and leadership in their countries. So we can't say. I mean, I can't say. Maybe someone else can. But all I know is it's a fight, and I've been around a long time since I was involved in the campus activities when I was at high school and college. And the only thing I know how to do is to keep fighting, and keep fighting and fighting, and not be defeated. So I'm going to do everything I can. I try to with Africa. I've made myself a nuisance to the U.S. and they've communicated that to me, and that makes me feel good. But we can't give in at this point, even if the battle is not clearly drawn yet.
Thanks, Larry, and keep up the fight.
Well, if you don't give in,
yes,
then the enemy can't win until you cheat it. So if you keep fighting, you always have a chance.
Luta continua, as they say.
When you were talking, I was thinking about the time when I lived in Washington, D.C., and I knew there were a lot of young Africans going to Georgetown University and American University and so forth. And they're obviously the upper elite of their respective countries that are being taught at the American universities. And I'm sure this is still going on now. And I'm wondering how much these young students, these young African potential leaders, future leaders, are buying into the economic policies of the United States, or how much they're just there to actually find out what the economic policies of the United States are and then counter and work against them back home. So maybe you have something to say
No,
about that?
I mean, these institutions are huge. I mean, John Hopkins, CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies, the Elliott School, George Washington School of Elliott Strategic Studies. These places are huge. There are a lot of Africans going to these places. I've met some of them. Some of them are very bright, a lot of enthusiasm, which you always get with young people. But how much they have imbibed and adopted the U.S. policy and orientation, I don't know. But certainly the environmentalist movement is massive, and almost all the young people have adopted it. I find more resistance to the environmentalist movement among the people we discussed tonight, the people who are running countries who realize they need this energy. So the environmentalist operation is very corruptive to their thinking. So I couldn't tell you if it's good or bad. I don't know.
Yeah, and PD mentioned also the influence of the different diverse NGOs, non-governmental organizations in Africa. Can you say something about that?
Well, the NGOs, I didn't work with any NGOs for 40 years because I didn't trust them, I didn't like them. And now I do work with two NGOs. One is Watch Democracy Grow, and the other is Alliance Care Now. Alliance Care Now is an effort by an NGO to provide help for orphan children in Ethiopia. And the Watch Democracy Grow is a mixed bag, but the person who's running it in the Washington, U.S. area agrees with me. So she agrees that economic development has to be at the center of the conception of democracy. And I've written papers for this group, and I've made seminar presentations. But generally, the NGOs are pretty bad. And that's why I stayed away from them for over 40 years, because they have, whatever the enthusiasm of the younger people involved in them is, the people at the top are bad. And they are willing to overthrow countries. They get themselves part of regime change operations. They toe the line. They say, democracy, our way, election every 4 years. We will help you build that structure. United States, I think Blinken has said it, we want to export our structure of democracy. That's our big export. And these NGOs play into it. So I don't see a lot of good coming out of them, and a lot of them are controlled from the top. Open Society, George Soros, they're huge in Africa, and other organizations. But I will work with people who agree with me. So I found some people who agree with me and want to promote the kind of ideas that I am promoting. So that's why now, for the first time in my life, I'm working with two NGOs. I'm on the board of one of them. But I don't think they're very good, and their orientation is pretty bad, and they don't play a good role. I mean, I'm not against USAID money, USAID wheat going to countries. I've seen the 100-pound bags of wheat, and people do need them.
Yeah.
But the United States, USAID, which is not an NGO, it's an official government agency, they're not helping these countries develop their agriculture. So it's really, even if they do something good, and some of these NGOs might, it's extremely limited. I was up in this place in northern Ethiopia, which the war just ended between the TPLF and the government. And the TPLF had been run out of this area called Alamada. And I went to a warehouse and I wrote about it. And there was thousands and thousands of bags of 50 kilos of wheat, 100 pounds, USAID. And poor people were just carrying them on their back. And if they didn't get this wheat, they wouldn't live through the month. But on the other hand, the entire area around there where I was driven by my friends was agriculturally rich, potentially. So why don't we develop the agriculture so we don't have to have people carrying 100-pound bags of wheat on their back? And this is the absence of thinking that dominates the West and the NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so very, very much, Larry. You have certainly created a lot of thoughts in people's minds today with your presentation. And I hope from this, some positives will come out of it.
Yep.
I appreciate it very much. And we hope to see you soon again and hear from you again, of course. Okay.
Shukran Kazarian.
Okay. Which language is that?
Arabic. Thank you.
Arabic.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
very
Larry.
much.
So when you
Okay.
say shukran in Arabic, the knee-jerk response is always afwan. You're welcome.
Okay, but that's not what, is that what the Arabs are saying?
If you say to someone shukran, which means thank
Yeah.
you, and
Yeah.
you say shukran gazillion, which means thank you very much, the minute you say shukran, any person who knows Arabic or is Arabic, they will immediately say afwan. You're welcome.
Okay.
I'm just telling you, next time you get into a conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Okay.
Good
All right.
night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks,
Okay.
Larry.
See you next week.